Friends, our scripture reading today comes from the book of Matthew in the 25th chapter, and it's the second parable in our sermon series, Unsettled. And the first one was the parable of the 10 young bridesmaids, and today we read the parable of the valuable coins, and hear these words. Jesus says, "The kingdom of heaven is like a man who is leaving on a trip. He called his servants and handed his possessions over to him. To one he gave 5 valuable coins, and to another he gave 2, and to another he gave 1. He gave to each servant according to that servant's ability, then he left on his journey. After the man left, the servant who had 5 valuable coins took them and went to work doing business with them. He gained 5 more. In the same way, the one who had 2 valuable coins gained 2 more. But the servant who had received the 1 valuable coin dug a hole in the ground and buried his master's money. Now after a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. The one who had received 5 valuable coins came forward with 5 additional coins. He said, 'Master, you gave me 5 valuable coins. Look, I've gained 5 more.' His master replied, 'Excellent. You are a good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over little. I'll put you in charge of much. Come, celebrate with me.' The second servant also came forward and said, 'Master, you gave me 2 valuable coins. Look, I've gained 2 more.' His master replied, 'Well done. You are a good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over little. I'll put you in charge of much. Come, celebrate with me.' Now the one who had received 1 valuable coin came and said, 'Master, I knew that you were a hard man. You harvest grain where you haven't sown. You gather crops where you haven't spread seed. So I was afraid, and I hid my valuable coin in the ground. Here, have what is yours.' His master replied, 'You evil and lazy servant. You knew I harvest grain where I haven't sown, and that I gather crops where I haven't spread seed. In that case, you should have turned my money over to the bankers so that when I returned, you could have given me what belonged to me with interest. Therefore, take from him the valuable coin and give it to the one who has 10 coins. Those who have much will receive more, and they will have more than they need. But as for those who don't have much, even the little bit they have will be taken away from them. Now take the worthless servant and throw him outside into the darkness. People there will be weeping and grinding their teeth." Friends, Word of God for the people of God, may it bless our living, doing, and understanding of His Word. I suppose I've always felt bad for the last guy in this parable. He gets the worst of it, and he had the least. And that hardly seems fair. He just wasn't as entrepreneurial as the other guys. Maybe he didn't have any experience. He didn't know what he was supposed to do. Still, the punishment to me seems a bit harsh. But this is one of those passages where the source of the storyteller itself here is probably worth listening to. The fact that Jesus is the one speaking here almost certainly requires us to take a closer look and see how even my resistance to hearing this parable may be misplaced. In a sermon delivered in 1738, John Wesley spoke about blessings God has given us. He writes, "All the blessings which God bestowed upon humankind are of His mere grace, abundance, and favor. His free, undeserved favor, favor that is undeserved, people having no claim to the least of His mercies. It was free grace that formed humankind from the dust of the ground and breathed into them a living soul, and stamped on that soul the image of God, and put all things under their feet. The same free grace continues to us at this day, life and breath in all things," he writes. He writes that for there is nothing we are, or have, or do, which we can deserve the least from God's hands. All we do, O God, He put in us. These, therefore, are so many instances of free mercy. And whatever good may be found in us, this is also the gift of God. This is one of my favorite sermons from Wesley, where he writes, "If then sinful humans should find favor with God, it is grace upon grace. If God places blessing on us, the greatest of all blessings, salvation, what can we say about these things but thanks be to God for this unspeakable gift?" The message here that Wesley is giving is one you've probably heard in the past. Salvation by faith, being saved, born again, made new, received new life. You may have heard it a bunch of different ways, and for some of it may conjure up fond memories of a church camp or church service where you grew up. But For others, honestly, the message of being, quote-unquote, saved, to borrow Brother Wesley's term, is not one that brings fond memories, but instead delivers a message of feeling left out, harsh, excluded, or maybe just brings on more rules that you have to follow. And I don't know about you, that's almost the last message I want to hear right now. This passage about the slave who did not invest his blessings well is not the passage I want to hear this year. 2020 feels a lot like a one-talent kind of year. But I don't think that's the point of the question or the point of what Jesus is raising here. A while back, I had a family member who was admitted to the hospital for spots that were identified on his brain that were cancerous. He'd been dealing with lung cancer before, and my mom had been taking him back and forth to his doctor's appointments, and I don't need to get into the whole thing, but to put it plainly, he grew up rough. My mom told him at one point that she was praying for him. "Some good that does, who cares?" he said. And he went on, holding on to bitterness and resentment and in that moment, and who could blame him? Where was the grace to be found in such a bleak situation? Maybe he had a point. Fred Craddock tells a similar story about his childhood. He tells about his mother who would bring them to church every Sunday, but his father never went. And when his father was diagnosed with a terminal illness, back then you did what any small town woman in the hills of Kentucky would do. You called the preacher. Now, if any of you are sick, don't call the preacher, call a doctor. But he recounted the story of the preacher who would come sometimes with an evangelist as an assistant to try to convince his father that he needed to have faith for the sake of his salvation. He remembered his father's response was always the same: "Church don't care about me, Pastor." "What do you want? Another dime, another pledge, Pastor? That's all you're after, another dime, another pledge. Is that what you want?" "Church don't care about me." Fred Craddock recalled he went to his father's hospital room where he had been hooked up on ventilators and had a small tube in his throat to help him breathe. He couldn't talk, so he could write. He noticed that all around him were all manner of cards, flower arrangement, personal notes, and gifts, all from members of their small little country church. Fred says his dad grabbed an empty tissue box, and on it he wrote, with bated and labored breath, "Tell my story." He asked his dad, "What story?" And his dad wrote back, "I was wrong." Apparently, there was grace to be had and found that day in that hospital room. Where do you find grace? Grace, the very presence of God in your life right now. Yes, even in 2020 with its compounding dilemmas that have compounded the complexity and hardships in everybody's life. The call to have faith is true, but here's what I see: people can't find grace. That's what I see. I see people looking to find ways, places, and people. People in places that are isolated, where people who are at high risk are feeling isolated and cut off from everybody else. They can't seem to find the grace of being cut off. And those of us that, or they feel less than because they're at risk of contracting this disease. Yes, I'm thinking of those that have been separated from us in this society. I'm also thinking of those black members of our society who have been relegated to the outside of our communities for far too long, and police officers today who struggle every day to show up to do the work and feel the added pressure of feeling inadequate or put down. And of course, the church itself has had its struggles that continue, trying to move people to greater understanding and compassion and love, getting over the old days that said, you can't come in here, you're an alcoholic, you're divorced, you're gay. Where do people find grace? I know sometimes in life it's harder at times than others, and we hear the scripture passages about the master and the return to find an untrustworthy slave, and we ask, where's the grace here? But wherever you are in life, whether you're experiencing one of those times where it's just hard to find it, to find God in the midst of hardship, or you're feeling tossed by the waves of pandemic, cultural shifts, and an election year to boot, I can't help but think it's a grace to know the whole story. The story of a baby born from nothing, escaped persecution from a government that said he was not welcome, to be raised in a house of grace where he was nurtured by his mother, raised into a man where he would walk the streets finding people that needed grace. He went to the rich man who wasn't welcomed in the town for the unfair business practices, sat and ate a meal with him, and after one afternoon of receiving grace, the man gives half of what he owes to the poor, and he was saved. It helps to know the story of a woman who wasn't accepted by society because of being sick for 12 years. She reached for grace and found it in this man's acceptance, and she was saved. It helps, I think, to know the story of a young man who took all the money his family had worked hard to provide for him. He gambled it away, too afraid to return to the source of grace, and hides himself in pity and despair, only to realize he is capable of being loved, returns home to the love of his family, received grace, and was saved. It helps to know the story of a prostitute, in those days likely forced into sexual slavery. She looked for grace and found only men's selfish ambition. Having nothing to give, she gave a small act of love to a man named Jesus, where she was hoping to find grace, only to have her hope met, and she was saved. It helps to know the story of the man who said it's not enough, that it is enough. It should not be that you should go unloved, and they removed his crown and replaced it with thorns. They took his clothes and cast lots. He gave his life for the gift of grace. But it didn't end there. He sent a people to continue this mission of grace. He sent them, gave them everything he had, to people being agents of grace, to bring hope to the hopeless, healing to those who need healed, reconciliation where there is division, and grace to all people, despite your race, religion, sexual orientation, political affiliation, socioeconomic status. None of that matters. God is not partial. Everyone is fully loved. Everyone has divine worth, not as a measure of what you do, but simply because of who you are. As I quoted John Wesley earlier, grace is the source. We are sent into the world to be the source of love that changes the world. We are sent to be grace upon grace. Now, when I think of it now, that slave who was only given the one talent made the mistake of thinking of what was given to him belonged to him. And his response to what was given was not the heart of the master. I can't help but think that he didn't know the story. And in his fear and anxiety ran off to store up what he was given. So how do we find fulfillment and remain settled despite uncertainty? We are not to live our lives as the last slave in the story. That regardless if it's a 10-talent kind of year or a 1-talent kind of day, we don't live our lives and hold our blessings, time, talent, and our resources with closed fists. Instead, because we know the story, we live lives of generosity with open arms and hands, just like the one who opened his arms to you. Friends, what are you holding on to that you just need to let go of? That you can place in the very hands of the Master? Where are you feeling unfulfilled in this life because you know God has given you more to be able to serve the world He created? Where is the grace in your life today? Because if I know the story as well as you do, I bet it's more than enough to give back, to invest into this world. And for what you can, hear the words of the Master, "Well done, good and trustworthy servant." May it be so.